Railroad. So given the recent success of NV Ranger and Company's surveying of the towns and neighborhoods of the Mojave, we've been given a larger contract this time from an associate of Mr. House who wants us to map out the entirety of the railways around the New Vegas region. This overlooked aspect of New Vegas's map is actually a lot more relevant than I ever realized, and I bet you that today there's going to be quite a few things that you haven't noticed before involving this railway. On behalf of my employer, I have traveled across every inch of this railway multiple times. I know it very well at this point, almost intimately. Of course, there are many marked locations along this route, but there are even more unmarked locations and aspects. So during my travels, I went ahead and took about 3.5 pages worth of notes detailing every bit that I found relevant to return to the employer, and then I took it upon myself to create a railway map detailing each of those locations and marked them using this key. I went through and marked every tunnel, locomotive, control tower, road crossing, service station, every disruption across the railroad, which there are many of. We have train stations, work sites, settlements that it passes almost directly, stop points, and then map exits. There's a lot to get into here, so throw your conductor's caps on. That's all you'll be needing because currently the New Vegas Express only runs on foot. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It helps out the channel in a free way, and how else am I going to afford my jet? I mean sarsaparilla. New Vegas's railroads actually make quite a bit of sense. I've said this before in other videos, but the map is based on US Geological Survey data, and at least portions of this railroad do mimic the real-life railroad that runs through the Las Vegas area. Beyond that, I want to mention that just prior to the time that New Vegas takes place in, the NCR was actually using this railway with an actual locomotive train running on it back and forth between Sloan, Quarry Junction, and Boulder City. Sloan and its quarry do exist in real life as well, and the NCR was using the mining town to extract the limestone in Quarry Junction, put it on the train, run it to Boulder City where there is still a usable mixing plant, which we'll get to later, and then using that cement to create different fortifications and bunkers near the Hoover Dam and along the front lines of their war with the Legion. Given that information, my employer sees the potential in getting this railway back up and fully operational across the entire area. So let's begin down here in the south, and then we'll work our way across the railroad. Our southernmost point takes us to Crescent Canyon, where we can see the railroad exits the map here via a bridge that has collapsed, but we can see it continues on just afterwards. Now in real life, when we look at where the railroad goes in a similar location, we can see it ends up going all the way to Barstow, California. Funny enough, the locomotive trains have a symbol on the side of them saying Barstow on them, so there's a connection to real life as well. This means we have our first map exit arrow pointing out this way, and then we also have a disruption marker to place given the bridge has collapsed through, and we can see all the rail cars that have fallen down to the bottom of Crescent Canyon. Now if we move a little bit further north, we'll have a split in the tracks, and this will take us back south through a tunnel that will also consider a map exit. Despite the tunnel being closed, we can't actually access the inside of it. Strange little detail here, we can actually find one of the lottery tickets from the Legion-Nipton lottery situation sitting just outside the boarded door next to this tunnel. Maybe this means that somebody escaped the Nipton lottery, the Legion didn't get to kill them, they made their way over and ran out through this tunnel. So now we can get back going north and we'll run into the town of Nipton, where we also have a railroad crossing where there's an intersection between the railroad and Nipton Road. So before we proceed, unsurprisingly, the most common marker we are going to be placing down is disruptions in the track. Now these can vary from very large disruptions to just piles of dirt and debris covering the tracks, and that's what I'm going to count. That's the lowest level of disruption I'm going to count, is a pile of dirt, sand, whatever, entirely covering at least one part of the track, as apparently a significant amount of dirt on train tracks, especially if it accumulates into a large pile, can create an uneven service and potentially derail the train. If you know more about this, feel free to speak up in the comments. As we carry on north of Nipton, we're going to run into 2 of these debris piles covering the tracks. I also ran into some coyotes. I did my best not to disturb the local wildlife, but it didn't work out too well. In the same canyon, we're going to run into our first railroad relevant location, by name at least, in the emergency service rail yard. There's also a stop point here in this little split in the tracks. Now at this location, we can see that there's a campfire, which perhaps indicates that the railroads are used by travelers on foot looking to avoid the roads for whatever reason. Potentially if they're an outlaw like the powder gangers, they might prefer running into wildlife rather than NCR soldiers. We can also find a dead bright follower back here. So although this one didn't make it to the grade beyond, or maybe they did, this does give us a little bit of an idea as to the route that group took to get get to the Repcon test facility. And that takes us through likely what is the least dense area of the railroad in terms of our markers. After this, we're going to get into a lot of really dense, meaty areas. So just after this, we have a railroad crossing just at the NCRCF, and then we have a couple of rail cars that are either entirely blocking the tracks, like this one whose wheels are just slightly offset, and then this one that's closer to Sloan where it's tipped over off to the side, but its wheels are still blocking it. I think a train passing through would run into that. I don't know if it would derail it, but that's besides the point. It's still something worth marking. We also have the mining town of Sloan over here to our left, and then Quarry Junction as well. This is where the limestone was being shipped from that we talked about earlier. The mine has been inactive since the powder gangers broke out of the NCRCF, came over here and stole all of their dynamite. Whenever the miners stopped mining, the Deathclaws moved into the quarry because it was quiet over there, and now everything has gotten much worse. You have convicts running all over the I-15 and the railroad, and then you have Deathclaws covering this upper part of the I-15 as we get closer to Vegas. This is a subtle detail that has a major impact on the greater story of the game. The I-15 being closed isn't just blocking NCR travel to get back from their homeland into the area of the Strip and places like Camp McCarran, it's also blocking a part of their infrastructure and stopping trains from moving to and from Sloan and Boulder City and helping them build up defenses. This is also one of many indications that the NCR might end up losing the second battle at the Hoover Dam. Just to the right of the railroad tracks across from Quarry Junction, we can see we have an unmarked service station here. We see this towering yellow crane. I meant to talk about this back at the emergency service station. There are quite a few of these things dotted around the map, and they're really interesting looking, but if you aren't paying attention, you can easily just walk by and not think much of them. And this makes sense. They don't really serve any purpose to the player, but they do display the detail that's actually put into the railroad tracks of this game. And I also wanted to mention this before we get too far past Quarry Junction. There is a ton of mining equipment and machinery within the quarry, and it doesn't look like it's been sitting there for 200 years. This stuff is clearly in use recently, but I didn't know about the functional train running between Sloan and Boulder City and the cement mixing plant and all of that until recently. I just find it interesting to think about, and it's one of those angles that really shows that New Vegas was displaying a world within Fallout that was starting to build back, and we're seeing civilizations start to put some pieces back together, but just along with the themes of war never changes, with the progress comes regress. As things start to get built up back and better, the powder gangers and Deathclaws come along and everything is back to as it was. Anyway, enough yapping. We have a job to do, and we do have a railroad crossing just at the intersection where Black Mountain begins and the road that leads up it. Just beyond that, in this Deathclaw dense region, we have the Junction 15 railway station, which is one of the few marked train stations in game, and then another railroad crossing just beyond that. We can see that that's a pretty common marker as well. Now here is where we come to a major split, and the railway takes two entirely different directions. The left one is going to carry us much further north, whereas this one to the right is going to carry us more northeast. We'll take the one to the right and go northeast first. Quickly to the right, we have a little bit of debris covering the tracks, and then we're going to run into a train station that sits right next to the Repcon headquarters. There's even a little catwalk that takes you from the train station platform all the way up to the Repcon headquarters, so maybe this is sort of a tourist destination. Hop off your train ride, go check out the headquarters, and then hop back on. Maybe it's left you by then, I'm not sure. We have another railway crossing on the road just after the Repcon headquarters, a bit of debris before we eventually run into the Followers Outpost. Now the Followers Outpost actually uses one of the railway traffic control towers as its base. We can also see it's covered in dormant railway tracks, and I'm not going to mark each of these to not clutter the map up too much, but there is a ton of debris under a lot of these rail cars, and they eventually meet two different stop points here. Then as we try and leave the station, we run into even more debris. I should have brought a broom, and then we hit two more railroad crossings. Now with these railroad crossings, there aren't the arms and the signs and things that stop cars from crossing if the train is coming. It seems a little bit dangerous. I'm not sure if, the time passing has just led to these things blowing away, or if scrappers and prospectors have come and taken the parts from them, but we'll see this consistent throughout much of the tracks. There are times where they have the arms and the signs and things, and then there are times where they don't. Surprise, surprise, we have some more debris, but we finally made it to the town of Boulder City. It's not really a city. We do have one of the very few locomotive cars here, a train station right on the edge of town, along with the Boulder City mixing plant, and then just beyond that we have a railroad crossing before we reach a stop point, which isn't much of a stop point. The tracks just kind of fall over the edge of this hill into disarray. I don't really understand what happened here other than the explosions that took place in Boulder City after the first battle of Hoover Dam potentially potentially causing a lot of disruption in the tracks. We also have 3 more stop points at the rail yard over here. Boulder City has so much potential. It's close to Lake Mead, fresh water. It's close to the Hoover Dam, tons of power. It's close to the 188, tons of trade. It has a locomotive train, it has a train station, and it still sucks. I'm just saying, as long as the Legion doesn't win the war, you might want to get over here and plant some roots, get some cheap real estate, because it might turn into something. Anyway, that's the end of our shorter right branch. We're now going to head back to the split just after the Junction 15 railway station, and then we'll continue on north. Of course, we have a couple debris piles along the way as soon as we take this branch, but has anybody ever noticed these enormous farms right to the left of the railway tracks? I had to talk about these for a bit. They're giant. You could feed all of New Vegas. They're just sitting here. There's like some fire geckos and powder gangers hanging out in them. They look like they've even been worked recently too. It makes me curious as to what exactly was happening here before the events of the game, but eventually we're going to run into another railroad crossing, and then we'll hit the Samson rock crushing plant. Now this is one of those locations that I feel like nobody knows about. I don't know anything about it. It's just a rock crushing plant. I know it's involved in the one potential side objective fiend quest where you can take the first recon over here to take shots at Driver Nephi, but outside of that it's largely irrelevant. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy locations like this in game. They're eerie and they offer a window into that long lost world. And beyond that, most of us aren't going to be able to go walk around some rock crushing plant in real life, but here we are in game and we can go explore it because it's the post-apocalypse and nobody's using it. No one cares if you're there or not. It's just like walking down the middle of the highway in game. I hope most of us aren't doing that in real life and we don't really get a chance to go walk in the highway. You're usually in a car when you're in the highway, but in game you can go be on your feet right in the middle of the road. After that we have a bit more debris, another railroad crossing, and then a whole big cluster of rail cars knocked all over the place. And we even have this big rail car wall made out of South Vegas where the fiends hide out. I am deeply curious as to how they pulled this off, or whoever did it pulled it off. There's no machinery in the area that would display how they would have managed this, how they're moving gigantic rail cars to make a wall out of them, especially when they're just a bunch of chemmed up fiends. Like, how did they figure this out? Maybe they just all got together and pushed. But we do have another stop point right up here before New Vegas Steel, and that's another work site that we can mark on the map. If we go inside of New Vegas Steel, we can see that it's still running on an automated testing function of some sort. We can see all the molten steel and the work that's going on with the Mr. Handy units all throughout. Aside from all the debris, convicts, and giant mutant lizard chameleon goats, New Vegas seems to be in a pretty good state in terms of its infrastructure. This railway is incredibly useful, or at least could be. It has the potential to be. We have functioning quarries. We have a functioning cement mixing plant. We have a functioning steel plant. All of this that's going on, if someone could just take advantage of it. I sound like I'm about to run for office or something, so let's get back to this. We have some more debris, another railroad crossing, more debris, another railroad crossing, and then another railroad crossing and another railroad crossing. They just keep on coming. The larger issue with this section of railway is that it's running through South Vegas, which is entirely fiend territory. So getting in here, clearing the debris, and getting things working would be incredibly dangerous. And on top of that, if any train was running through this section of tracks, no doubt it would be sabotaged and looted by the fiends here. Just on the other side of the I-15 though, we do have Camp McCarran not far away from here. And then if we go a bit further north and in the opposite direction, we do have the Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters. The railroad will eventually take us out of South Vegas up past West Side, not too close to it though. We will hit another railroad crossing. More importantly though, that railroad crossing is right next to the South Cistern. The South Cistern produces clean, fresh water. So there's a chance that we could be taking the train up past here, throwing some water on it, and moving that throughout the Mojave to help get water distribution out there as well. Just after the cistern though, we are going to run into a bit more debris and eventually the walls of Vegas, more specifically the walls that are going to keep us out of Freeside. So we're going to have to go around, go into Freeside, and then find the location where the tracks pick back up. I love the consistency here. It's not very hard to do at all. All we do is go through the north gate of Freeside and worm our way back into the corner where we'll see a train station. Mine's going to look a little bit different because I have Tale of Two Wastelands running, but it's the same thing. There's a train station here, and then we have another traffic control tower. I also want to note that there's a split in the tracks here that leads to a stop point. Now, where does that stop point go exactly? It's hard to tell because we just run into, again, the walls of Freeside, but just on the other side of these walls, we have the H&H Tools Factory, which might be another relevant work site location for the railroad to pass by. Continuing down the right split, we can see we have more debris falling on the tracks, but this time it's not the dirt and dust of the Mojave Desert. It's actually the debris falling from the I-15 overpass up above it. This is at least more interesting than what we've been seeing previously. And then after that, we can see we have a collapsed building falling on top of it. I only really have enough room to mark this as one, so we'll just put one debris marker here. And then running through what I believe is Fremont Street and Freeside, we have another railroad crossing that eventually will lead us just past the old Mormon fort. We'll mark this as the general Freeside settlement though, and then we're going to run into a little bit more debris and then the walls of Freeside again. We'll have to loop back around out of the north gate and find out where we pick up at. This is interesting because it applies a focus on how alien and strange this world is. There are these giant walls that are put up and meant to segregate certain people out of the section. Even though Freeside isn't a place you would want to be, there are probably better places like we discussed in the best neighborhoods of Vegas to live in. West Side is probably much better than Freeside in many regards, but still it's just odd trying to navigate around these walls when we can see that the world previous had the railroad running right through here. There was nothing obstructing it. We'll hit a little bit more debris on the other side of those walls before we pass by the Crimson Caravan. I'm going to mark this as a work site as well. It would just be very useful to be able to run hauls past the Crimson Caravan, drop things off, especially if the NCR are the ones that end up with control of this railroad, but whoever ends up using the Crimson Caravan's location could be useful for them as well. I also want to note that we can see a road coming out from the Crimson Caravan's walls, which means this is another location that was built and set up in the post-war, something I hadn't really considered beforehand. Just at the edge of where the Crimson Caravan ends, we're going to hit some more debris, and then some more debris, and then two more railroad tracks before we eventually come to another split. The left route is actually going to take us into Nellis Air Force Base via an alternative route. There's that main gate that you'd usually approach, have the boomers come at you and be like, hey, what are you doing here? This one is going to take us to a gate that's a lot further to the right. The tracks actually continue really far into the Air Force Base, so of course we're going to have the Nellis settlement right over here. We'll hit a couple of railroad crossing patches, and then there's what seems to be another service station and a traffic control tower before we run into another small split that ends up just leading us to two stop points. Now this really gives us some perspective as to the kind of powerhouse that this region could become. We have a railroad going past all of these different work sites that are still intact, and now it's taking us to an airport, and we know that the boomers eventually get an airplane working, so you could have a train running here to give shipments to an airplane. There could just be so much going on in the New Vegas region down the road. I guess I should say down the railroad. Now we'll head down the right split, which will finally take us to another tunnel. Fortunately, we can actually go inside of this one. Unfortunately, there's a ton of booby traps, debris covering the tracks in here, and feral ghouls to make things even worse. There are also very hard locks on both sides of the tunnel to enter them. I'd imagine that the boomers set this up. There's no information from what I know, but you'd think that they're the ones who are making it very difficult to traverse through this tunnel because it takes you pretty close to their territory and they don't want people there. To make things even worse, when you exit the other side of the tunnel, there are tons of death claws everywhere. We have a little bit more debris and then a railroad crossing before we end up at the gypsum train yard. Right next to the train yard is what I will refer to as the gypsum quarry or mine of some sorts. It's another work site location we can mark, and then as we continue down the tracks, we can see that we have three stop points, a bunch of different rail cars, and a locomotive car. If we take the track that actually continues, we can see a little raised platform here. Now it doesn't have a building, but I'm going to mark this as a train station, as it seems like a place where people were dropped off or hopping on to the trains that were running by. And then if we continue on, we'll get some more debris. Of course, how else could we end this? And then eventually ending in Colville Bay. We have a couple things to mark here at Colville Bay. Obviously, there's a stop point, but we also have the third locomotive train to mark. Now, I read somewhere, I think on the wiki, that there were only 2 locomotive trains on the map, but I found 3. There's one at the gypsum train yard, like we just discussed, this one right here, and then if you recall, there's another one at Boulder City near the mixing plant. So you're welcome. I'm out here doing the real legwork. We also have another service station. It's a bit destroyed though, and then I'm actually going to mark this, whatever this storage container area over here, as a work site. It's something relevant to the infrastructure of this train yard, I'd imagine. Things get dropped off here, maybe put on a boat, shipped out to Lake Mead somewhere. I don't know. Okay, so now we can take a look at our final and complete map where we've marked all of the relevant locations along the railroads. Let's go through and tally up each of those locations and see how many instances there are of them. We'll start with the tunnels. We have 3 markers for them, but really we only have 2 different tunnels that the railway seems to go through. And then, like I said earlier, we have 3 of those locomotive trains, 3 control towers across the map. I figured there might be more of those, but that's it, just 3. 22 road crossing sections, or railroad crossing sections rather. Then we have 4 service stations. The most common marker right up there with railroad crossings was disruptions and debris across the railroads, which makes sense in a post-apocalyptic game, even if you want to call it a post-apocalyptic game. Still, a lot of sections in the map are bad. Then we have 5 train stations. I was also thinking there might be more of these. Whenever I noticed the unmarked one next to the Recon headquarters, I was thinking, oh, like how many of these things have I really just kind of walked by and not thought about? We also have another unmarked one in Boulder City, but not that many, just 5. We have 8 different marked work sites, which again speaks to how functional and useful this railway system could be if used properly. Then we have 6 settlements that it sort of directly or indirectly passes by. You could add or subtract a few to this, that's maybe one of the more loose categories. We have 12 different stop points, and then if you noticed, we actually covered the 2 map exit points of the railway right at the beginning of the video. There are no more points where the railway leaves the map. I thought that was kind of strange, because obviously we can see 2 different points where the railway leaves the map, and then there are many instances across New Vegas where the roadways leave the map and we can't continue to follow them. But for whatever reason, they decided to stop them up in Nellis, which isn't true. If you go in real life and look at a map, you can see the railway does go by Nellis Air Force Base. It goes through it, but of course it goes well beyond the Las Vegas region. So there we go. That's our full map. That's the tally count for all the locations we found along the way. I enjoyed this process. I enjoyed going through the lesser traveled parts of this map and getting to know this game that I've played for so long in a different perspective. Another interesting point is that these railroad tracks will take you through hell and back. I mean, you start in Nipton, a burned down town, and obviously Crescent Canyon's a mess, but as you proceed through, you're going through Powder Ganger territory, you're roaming through Deathclaw riddled regions, going next to Black Mountain, you're going through Fiend territory in South Vegas, and then eventually you're going to get bombed by the boomers, and of course you're finishing off with more Deathclaws near the Gypsum Rail Yard, and then finally Cazadors near Colville Bay. It's interesting. I mean, of course there are many dangerous regions of the Mojave, but the railroad seems to take you through the worst of them. Maybe there's a challenge in there for you. Try and cross the entirety of the railroad with just a 9mm pistol and 100 bullets. See if you can do it. Let me know how it goes. I'm gonna go turn this report into my employer. Hopefully I get a big fat bonus, and I'll see you in the comments.